Right before exchanging rings at my daughter's wedding, she stepped onto the stage in front of 300 guests and announced, "Dad, that house will belong to my mother-in-law. It's the right thing to do." The entire ballroom erupted in applause while I stood frozen watching the home I built, with my late wife being given away like a gift. Then her husband leaned close and whispered, "You're too old to need that house." They didn't know I was still the only person who could decide its fate. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, you're exactly where you need to be. Welcome to Dad Family Revenge. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, your country, your city, even just your time zone. I read every single one. Some elements in this story are fictional, crafted for entertainment and education. Any resemblance to real people or places is coincidental, but what I'm sharing with you today matters. I've built a lot of things in my life. Bridges over rivers that flood every winter, overpasses that carry 40,000 cars a day without anyone below giving it a second thought. Load-bearing walls engineered to hold weight that most people never think about until something goes wrong. For 30 years, I showed up to job sites before sunrise and left after dark, and I was proud of every structure I ever signed my name to. But the morning of my daughter's wedding, standing in the doorway of the grand ballroom at the Nines Hotel in downtown Portland, I told myself the most important thing I had ever built was her. Emily was 23 feet away in a white gown that caught the light from the chandeliers above. Her hair was pinned up the way her mother used to wear hers on Sunday mornings, and when she turned and saw me standing there, she smiled so wide it pushed tears right to the edge of her eyes. My chest tightened so hard I had to press my fist against my sternum for a second, just to remind myself to breathe. "Dad." She crossed the distance between us and took both my hands. "You look so handsome. You look like your mother," I said, and my voice cracked on the last word in a way I hadn't planned for. I cleared my throat. Margaret would have been beside herself today. Emily squeezed my hands and her eyes went bright and wet. "I feel her here, Dad. I really do." I believed her. I wanted so badly to believe her. The ballroom held 300 guests. Colleagues, neighbors, old friends of Emily's from Portland State. People I recognized, and people I had never seen in my life. Round tables draped in ivory linen, towering floral centerpieces of imported garden roses, a string quartet playing near the tall windows. It was more than we had agreed on 6 months ago, when Emily and I sat at my kitchen table with a notepad and a carefully written budget. I noticed the flowers first far more expensive than what we had discussed. I noticed and I let it go. It was her wedding day. Daniel Cole was working the room the way a man works a room when he needs people to remember him. Firm handshakes, eye contact held a beat too long laughter that arrived exactly on cue. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered with the groomed confidence of someone who had practiced being impressive. When he spotted me near the entrance, he crossed over immediately, arms open. "Richard." He gripped my hand with both of his. "You look fantastic. Seriously." Thank you, Daniel," I said. "Nothing more." He laughed like I had said something clever and moved on to the next person. I had noticed early on that Daniel laughed at things that weren't quite funny. I had mentioned it to Emily once 2 years ago. She told me I was reading too much into it. Diane Cole was seated at the family table nearest the altar. Daniel's mother, 65, silver hair, a strand of pearls that caught the chandelier light every time she moved. She pressed both hands over her heart when Emily came down the aisle, and the expression on her face was so perfectly arranged, trembling lip, glistening eyes, slow exhale, that half the room turned to look at her instead of the bride. The ceremony was beautiful. The vows were personal. When Emily said "I do," her voice was steady and full of something that genuinely sounded like love, I sat in the front row with my hands folded in my lap, and my heart caught somewhere between gratitude and an unease I could not name. Then the officiant smiled and began to reach for the rings, and Emily raised her hand. "Wait." Her voice was clear and bright and carried across the entire room without the microphone. She turned to the officiant. "May I say something first, just one thing?" The officiant smiled warmly and extended the microphone. Emily took it with both hands, faced the room, and took one long breath. "I want to make a promise," she said, "in front of every person I love, before we exchange rings, before anything else." She turned and she looked directly at me. "Dad, Hargrove Hill is too big for one person. You've said it yourself more times than I can count." Her voice was warm and certain, and showed no hesitation whatsoever. "Daniel and I want Mom Diane to have it as her permanent home. It's the right thing to do. And I wanted everyone here to witness that." 300 people erupted into applause. Someone near the back made a sound like they were already crying. Diane covered her mouth with both hands, shoulders trembling. The woman 2 tables over was reaching for her tissues before Emily had finished the sentence. I sat very still in the front row, with the stems of the centerpiece pressing against my wrist, and the sound of 300 people applauding my daughter's generosity washing over me like water over stone. Daniel appeared at my shoulder a moment later. He had not orchestrated the moment, he had simply waited for it. His hand came down on my shoulder with the easy confidence of a man collecting something he had already decided was his. "You're getting old, Richard." His voice was low, almost friendly, barely audible beneath the applause. "What do you need a house that size for? Consider it good karma for your grandkids." I looked at his hand on my shoulder. Then I looked up at Emily, still holding the microphone, still smiling, still looking at me with that expression of warm and total certainty, and I understood that she had not been led to this moment. She had walked to it herself, planned it herself, and chosen the most public stage she could find to make sure it could not be undone. That was the first moment I understood what I was actually dealing with. Not Daniel, not Diane. My own daughter, who had grown up in that house, who had watched her mother choose every tile and every curtain and every doorknob, had just given it away with a smile and a microphone in front of 300 witnesses. And she had done it before I could say a single word. The applause lasted maybe 30 seconds. To me, standing there with Daniel's hand still on my shoulder and 300 faces turned in my direction, it felt like standing underwater with the pressure building in my ears and no clear surface above me. I waited until the clapping died down. Then I excused myself from the table, crossed the ballroom floor, and caught Emily near the edge of the dance area where the string quartet was beginning to tune for the reception set. "Emily." I kept my voice low and even. "Can we step aside for a moment?" She turned, still glowing, her bouquet held loosely in both hands. "Dad, isn't it wonderful? Daniel's been planning that for weeks. He wanted it to be a surprise." It was certainly that. I touched her elbow and guided her gently toward the corridor beside the service entrance, away from the nearest tables. "I need to talk to you about what was just announced." Her smile didn't disappear, but it shifted. The warmth pulled back a fraction, like a pilot light adjusting its flame. "Dad, today is not the day for this. Emily, that house belongs to both of us. You know that." I held her gaze. "Your mother and I." "Don't." Her jaw tightened. The bouquet rustled as her grip firmed. "Don't make this about Mom. This is about Daniel's family needing stability. It's about us starting our marriage the right way." The right way. I let that sit for a moment. "And what about my retirement? What about the fact that I used nearly everything I had left to help pay for this wedding? This ballroom, those flowers, the catering for 300 people. Emily's chin lifted just slightly, a gesture I recognized from when she was 16, and absolutely certain she was right about everything. You offered, Dad. You said you wanted to contribute. I did not offer Hargrove Hill. Nobody's taking anything from you. Her voice dropped to something firmer, stripped of its earlier warmth. Dad, how many years do you even have left? Why hold on to a house you'll just die in? My future matters more than your pride. The words hit me the way a structural failure hits not all at once, but in a sequence. First the sound, then the understanding of what the sound meant, then the full weight of it dropping through the floor. I stared at my daughter. The daughter I had driven to the emergency room at 2 a.m. when she was 9 years old and burning with fever. The daughter I had taught to parallel park in a rainstorm in the parking lot of a Fred Meyer on Southeast Powell. The daughter I had held on the floor of our kitchen the night her mother stopped breathing when we were both too destroyed to make it to the couch. She met my gaze without flinching. Before I could respond, Daniel appeared at Emily's shoulder, materializing the way he always did when a conversation was reaching a temperature he needed to manage. His hand found the small of Emily's back, and he aimed his most reasonable expression directly at me. Richard, I hope you understand this comes from a place of genuine love. He tilted his head slightly, the practiced gesture of a man pretending to be humble. We'll take excellent care of the property. It stays in the family. Think of it as keeping everything close. Hargrove Hill is not a piece of property, I said. It is the only thing I have left that Margaret and I built together. And it was never offered to anyone. Daniel's jaw moved once, a small, almost invisible clench. Then the smile returned smoother than before. We can talk about the details later. Today's about celebrating. I'd like to talk about them now. Emily put her hand on my arm, and for one brief second, her eyes softened, a flash of the girl I raised, before the expression sealed over again. Dad, please don't do this here. You're embarrassing yourself. Embarrassing myself. I breathed through that one slowly. It was Diane who ended it. She drifted toward us from the direction of the family table pearls, catching the chandelier. Light a soft handkerchief pressed to the corner of one eye. She touched my forearm with her fingertips, a feather-light, practiced gesture of comfort. Richard, you raised such a generous daughter. Her voice was warm as a radio announcer selling mattresses. You should be so proud of the young woman she's become. Truly. Then she turned to Emily, squeezed her hands, and steered her gently back toward the tables without waiting for me to respond. Daniel lingered for one extra second. He looked at me, and for that single second the smile was fully gone, replaced by something flat, and assessing the way a contractor looks at a wall he's deciding whether to demolish. Get some food, Richard, he said quietly. Enjoy the evening. Then he was gone, threading back into the crowd. The warm handshakes, resuming the laughter, arriving on cue. I stood in the corridor beside the service entrance and listened to the string quartet start up again, something light and celebratory that the guests were already responding to, chairs, scraping voices rising. Through the ballroom's tall windows, Portland glittered in the October afternoon, all amber light and turning leaves indifferent and gorgeous. I thought about the kitchen tiles Margaret had spent 3 weekends choosing. I thought about her standing on that step stool laughing at herself. I thought about the oak tree in the backyard that she had planted the year Emily was born, which was now taller than the roofline. Then I left the reception early. I told the driver to take me home. The whole ride back, my hands stayed flat on my thighs, and I looked out the window at the city passing by, and I kept thinking about one thing: whether the locks at Hargrove Hill had already been changed before I even arrived at the ceremony that morning. I've come home to Hargrove Hill through 30 years of Oregon weather-winter fog so thick, you navigate by memory, spring rain, that turns the driveway into a shallow creek summer evenings when the air smells like pine and the neighbors have their sprinklers running. I knew every sound that house made, the way the front gate latch caught if you lifted it slightly before pressing, the way the porch light flickered for 3 seconds after you switched it on before it steadied. That night the porch light was off, and my suitcase was sitting outside the front door. Not all my belongings, just one bag, the leather rolling case Margaret had bought me for a conference in Seattle 17 years ago. Someone had packed it quickly, carelessly. A shirt sleeve was caught in the zipper. My reading glasses case was sitting on top, unzipped one lens, catching the pale glow from the neighbor's floodlight across the street. Beside the suitcase, a manila folder had been placed under a river rock, so it wouldn't blow away. I didn't open it yet. I already knew what kind of document gets left on a porch under a rock. My chest felt like someone had poured concrete into it and was waiting for it to set. I pressed the doorbell. The chime sounded inside that same 2-note tone Margaret had chosen because she said it sounded like a cello. I heard footsteps. The door opened. Daniel stood in the frame, still wearing his wedding dress shirt, cuffs unbuttoned and rolled to the elbow tie loosened. He looked at me the way a man looks at a contractor who has shown up on the wrong day. Richard. His voice carried the mild surprise of someone who had expected this to go more smoothly. I thought you'd spend the night somewhere. Give everyone space to settle in. This is my house, Daniel. My voice came out steadier than I felt. My hands hanging at my sides had curled into fists without my permission. We talked about this at the reception. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe, arms crossing loosely over his chest. Relaxed. Almost bored. The transition makes sense for everyone. You'll be more comfortable somewhere designed for your needs. Designed for my needs. I repeated it slowly. I'm 68 years old, and I ran a half marathon 2 years ago. What exactly are my needs, Daniel? He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, extending it toward me between 2 fingers, like he was offering a business card. It's a really well-reviewed facility. Private room meal service activity programs. I already put down a deposit, so there's no waiting list issue. I didn't take the paper. My eyes dropped to his hand, steady, unhurried, completely certain I would eventually reach out and accept what he was offering. The arrogance of that certainty made my molars ache. "Where is Emily?" I asked. "She's exhausted. It was an emotional day." He tilted his head, something shifting behind his eyes, a calculation running fast and quiet. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Richard. That's not fair to her." "I'd like to speak to my daughter." She asked not to be disturbed. His voice dropped half a register softer now, almost sympathetic. "Look, this is difficult. I understand that. But the cleanest thing for everyone is if you take a couple days, get settled at the facility, and then we can all sit down and discuss next steps like adults." The paper was still extended toward me. I looked at it once more. Then I looked past Daniel's shoulder into the house, my house, and through the archway into the living room. I saw a figure moving. Diane. She was in Margaret's reading chair, the high-backed green chair Margaret had reupholstered herself the summer before she got sick, and she had a glass of red wine in one hand and the television remote in the other. She didn't look toward the door. She didn't need to. Something cracked open in my chest. Not broke cracked. The way old timber sounds before the joint gives. "Daniel." My voice came from somewhere very deep and very controlled. "This conversation is not finished. For tonight it is." He straightened up from the doorframe, and the sympathetic expression evaporated cleanly like morning fog when the sun comes through. Get some rest, Richard. You'll think more clearly in the morning. He closed the door. Not a slam, just a firm, final click. I stood on the porch of the house I had owned for 29 years and listened to the latch engage. My legs felt hollow. The concrete in my chest had hardened fully now, pressing against my ribs from the inside. I picked up the manila folder from under the rock and unfolded it. The letterhead read, Cascade Valley Memory Care and Assisted Living. Private Room Daily Wellness Check Family Visitation Policy. A rate sheet was attached. Monthly cost $4,200. I put the folder in my coat pocket. I picked up my suitcase. I walked to the end of the driveway and called a cab because my hands were shaking too hard to manage the rideshare app safely. In the taxi, I pressed my back against the seat and stared at the roof and breathed. The driver asked me where I was going, and I said any decent motel near the waterfront, and he said sure thing and didn't ask anything else. I was grateful for that. In the motel room, clean, anonymous smelling of industrial laundry detergent and nothing personal, I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the manila folder again. I read the entire brochure. $4,200 a month for a private room. Daily wellness checks. Family visitation policy, which the brochure was careful to note was flexible and family-centered, whatever that meant. Daniel had already put down a deposit. He had put it down before the wedding. I set the folder on the nightstand. Then I put my face in both hands and pressed hard. Not crying, not yet, just pressing. Until the pressure from my palms was the only thing I could feel. 30 years in construction means your body stops recognizing sleep as something that goes all the way through the night. I was awake at 5, staring at the water stain on the motel ceiling, listening to a garbage truck work its way down the block outside. By 5:30, I had showered, dressed, and drunk the worst cup of coffee I have ever had from a machine in the hallway that charged $2 and tasted like hot brown regret. By 6, I was standing at the back fence of my own property. I knew the rear gate code because I had programmed it myself 11 years ago, a 6-digit sequence I had never written down anywhere because I had never needed to. My fingers found the numbers without thinking. The gate swung inward with the familiar aluminum on aluminum scrape that I had been meaning to oil for 2 years. The backyard was still. The oak tree Margaret had planted the year Emily was born stood in the far corner. Its leaves gone amber and rust in the October cold, a few of them drifting loose in the morning quiet. The garden beds along the south fence, the ones Margaret had designed herself, the ones I had watered every other evening through 3 summers after she was gone, because I couldn't bring myself to let them die, had been churned up. Fresh soil, raw and dark. Whatever she had planted, there was gone. I turned toward the house, and then I saw the bin. The large rolling garbage container was parked beside the back steps, lid propped open with a broken curtain rod. I almost walked past it. Then something caught a corner of dark wood frame, the edge of something that did not belong in a trash bin. My stomach dropped straight through the ground. I stepped closer, reached in with both hands. The first frame I pulled out held our wedding photo. Margaret in her dress, ivory simple the way she wanted it, and me in the borrowed suit that was slightly too short in the sleeves. We were both laughing at something the photographer had said. I had forgotten what it was. I had never forgotten the sound of her laughing. The glass was cracked across the lower right corner, not from being dropped, from being shoved in sideways. Oh, Margaret. My voice came out wrecked and raw, barely above a whisper. My eyes burned so hard, the yard blurred at the edges. Oh, sweetheart. I kept pulling things out, both hands moving, shaking. A framed photo of Emily at age 4 sitting on Margaret's lap on the front porch swing, both of them squinting into the summer sun. A shoebox, the one I kept on the top shelf of the bedroom closet, the one I had not opened in 4 years, because I was not always certain I could close it again. I lifted the lid with one finger. Margaret's wedding ring was still inside. Her reading glasses. The last birthday card she had ever written me in her handwriting that slanted uphill when she was happy. At the bottom of the bin, caught under a split trash bag, was the cream-colored cardigan she had knitted herself the winter before her diagnosis, the one with the small brown buttons she had driven 40 minutes to a specialty shop in Lake Oswego to find, because she wanted them to be exactly right. She had given it to me Christmas morning, both of us sitting on the floor because the couch was too far from the tree. She had watched me open it with the expression of someone who knew they had gotten it exactly right. My knees buckled. I caught myself on the rim of the bin, both arms bracing, chest heaving. I was not going to fall apart in my own backyard. I was not going to give that to anyone. I stood up straight. I breathed until my vision cleared. Then I gathered every item from that bin with the care of a man collecting things that cannot be replaced because they cannot. And I placed them in the canvas tote bag I had brought with me. The wedding photo, the shoebox, the cardigan, every frame, every piece. When the bag was full, I looked up at the house. Second floor master bedroom window. The curtains were different, gray, geometric, the kind sold in sets at a home goods store. Margaret's curtains, the ones she had sewn herself from fabric she found at a market in Selwood, were gone. My jaw tightened so hard my back teeth ached. I pulled out my phone. Scrolled to a name I hadn't called in almost 14 months, Frank Dalton. We had poured the foundation of my first project together back in 1994, a warehouse outside Salem that was still standing because we had done it right. Frank had retired from contracting 8 years ago and picked up a private investigator license, mostly, he always said, because boredom made him dangerous. I had never imagined calling him for something like this. I pressed call. It rang twice. Rich. Frank's voice was gravel and coffee. It is 6 in the morning on a Sunday. I know what time it is. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I need help, Frank. I need it today. A pause. Then no questions, no hesitation, nothing but the sound of Frank already moving. Tell me where you are. I'll bring the equipment. I didn't ask what equipment. I already knew. And the fact that I already knew that I was standing in my own backyard, with my dead wife's cardigan in a tote bag calling a private investigator at sunrise, told me everything I needed to understand about how far this had already gone. Frank Dalton showed up at my motel room door at 11 that morning, carrying a hard-sided equipment case, a bag of sandwiches from the deli on Burnside, and the particular expression he always wore when a problem had already been categorized and filed in his head before anyone else had finished describing it. He set the case on the small table by the window, cracked it open, and said nothing about the canvas tote bag sitting on the dresser with Margaret's cardigan folded on top. That was one of the things I had always valued about Frank. He knew which things to see and which things to leave alone. The camera system, he said, pulling out a laptop and 2 compact external drives. Walk me through what you installed. 6 units, I said, pulling up a chair. 4 interior, 2 exterior. I put them in 2 years ago after the neighborhood had a string of car break-ins. They're flush-mounted, built into the crown molding on the main floor and the beam brackets in the garage. The footage runs to a home server in the utility room closet. The server connects to the house Wi-Fi. Frank looked at me over the top of his glasses. And the Wi-Fi is still in your name. Account is registered to Richard Bennett, paid through automatic bank draft. Nobody has changed it. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to one Frank Dalton allowed himself on a working day. Then we're still in the system. Give me 20 minutes. I ate half a sandwich and watched Frank work. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the unhurried precision of a man who had learned long ago that speed and accuracy are not the same thing. Outside the motel window, Portland was going about its Sunday, a family loading kayaks onto a roof rack in the parking lot below someone's dog, pulling hard against a leash on the sidewalk, the distant sound of the Max train running its route along the waterfront. "I'm in," Frank said. "Servers intact. Footage going back 11 days. He turned the laptop toward me. "Where do you want to start?" "Last night, after I left." Frank scrubbed the timeline to 9:47 Saturday evening. The interior camera in the main hallway flickered to life, grainy but clear enough. The house looked different already. Someone had moved the console table near the staircase and replaced it with a coat rack I had never seen before. Then Daniel walked through the frame jacket off carrying 2 glasses of wine. He handed one to someone off camera and settled onto the couch. "Can you get audio?" I asked. "Already running." Frank turned up the volume. Emily's voice came through first, slightly compressed by the microphone. "Do you think he'll actually sign?" My throat tightened so fast it hurt. Daniel's voice was relaxed, almost amused. "He will. Give him a few days to feel lonely and scared. Old men always come around when the alternative is sitting in a motel room with no one to talk to." "And if he digs in?" Emily asked. The casualness in her voice, the way the question came out the same way someone asks whether to order pizza or Thai food, made my stomach lurch sideways. "He's 68 years old with no lawyer, no plan, and nowhere comfortable to go," Daniel said. "He'll sign. The only question is whether we give him a week or push for sooner." Frank's jaw was tight. He kept his eyes on the screen. The footage jumped forward. Frank scrubbed to Sunday morning, just after 7. A different camera angle the kitchen. Emily was on the phone, leaning against the counter in a silk robe, coffee in her free hand. Her voice was lighter than it had been the night before, almost businesslike. I couldn't see who she was calling, but from the way she spoke, measured reporting, like someone briefing a superior, I understood she was talking to Diane. "It's easy to manage," she said to whoever was on the other end of that call. "Always has been. Once the deed is signed, we put him in the cheapest nursing home we can find. A few $100 a month, and we never have to think about him again." The words landed like a structural beam dropping from height, the kind of impact that travels up through your feet before your brain registers what happened. My hands gripped the edge of the table. My knuckles went white and I couldn't make them loosen. Frank reached over and paused the footage. He turned to look at me directly. "Rich." His voice was low and level. "How are you doing?" "Keep playing it," I said. My own voice came out scraped raw like something dragged over gravel. "I need you to tell me you're okay first." "I'm not okay." I pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed through my nose. "But I need to see all of it. Every frame. Play it." Frank held my gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he turned back to the laptop. "Saving everything to the external drives as we go," he said. "Time-stamped, unedited. Admissible in Oregon Civil Court as evidence collected by the property owner through a security system he installed and owned." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was reading a technical spec, but I understood what he was doing. He was reminding me that what we were watching was not just pain. It was documentation. We watched 2 more hours of footage. By the time Frank closed the laptop, the sandwiches were long forgotten, and the afternoon light outside the window had gone gray with incoming rain. Frank leaned back in his chair and laced his fingers behind his head. "Richard, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually think before you answer. Ask, how much do you actually know about Daniel Cole? He held my gaze. Not what Emily told you. Not what he told you over dinner. What do you actually know? The question settled into the room like cold air through a gap in a wall. I opened my mouth. Then I closed it again, because the honest answer, the answer that arrived the moment Frank asked, was that I knew almost exactly what Daniel had chosen to show me. And nothing more. Before I tell you what Frank really found about Daniel Cole and the truth about Diane's so-called heart condition, drop a number 6 in the comments right now. Just that. It tells me you're still here. Because what's coming next is worse than anything you've imagined. Quick note, some details ahead are reconstructed for storytelling. If that's not for you, no hard feelings, step away now. But if you're staying, let's go. 30 years of reading blueprints teaches you one thing above everything else. The truth of a structure is never in what you can see. It is in what holds the visible parts up. The beams inside the walls. The rebar inside the concrete. The load calculations on page 47 of a document that most people never open. That Sunday night, Frank showed me a different kind of blueprint, the kind that shows exactly what a man is built on when nobody is watching. He started with Daniel. Daniel Aaron Cole. Frank said, reading from his screen fingers, moving through public records, court filings, business registration databases. Age 40. Registered agent for Cole Capital Investments LLC incorporated in Nevada 3 years ago. He paused. Nevada incorporation is a common move for people who want minimal disclosure requirements. Low filing fees, no state income tax, and you don't have to list your members publicly. Is that legal? I asked. Completely. Also completely common among people who want the appearance of a business without the substance of one. Frank pulled up the LLC's filing history. 3 years of registration. 0 recorded transactions. No business bank account linked to the entity in Oregon. No contracts filed. No employees registered. He looked at me. Rich, this company exists on paper the same way a movie set exists. It looks real from the front, and there's nothing behind it. My chest went tight. Emily thinks he's a successful real estate investor. Emily thinks what he told her. Frank kept going. I pulled his credit history through a licensed database. Daniel Cole has no mortgage, no investment property in his name, and a credit utilization rate of 83% across 4 personal cards. He turned the screen toward me. That means he's carrying debt on 83 cents of every dollar of available credit. That is not what a successful investor looks like. That is what a man running on fumes looks like. I pressed 2 fingers hard against my sternum, where the pressure had been sitting since the night before. Hi. There's more, Frank said. I found a civil dispute filed in King County, Washington, that's Seattle 4 years ago. A woman named Sandra Merritt filed a complaint against Daniel Cole, alleging financial misrepresentation. She claimed he convinced her to transfer $22,000 into a joint investment account he controlled, then dissolved the account after they broke up. Frank's voice stayed flat and professional, but his eyes were not. The complaint was withdrawn 8 months later. No public reason given. He found a way to make her drop it, I said. My voice came out hollow. That would be consistent with the pattern. Frank closed that window and opened another. Now, Diane. Tell me she's actually sick. I said, even though I already knew from the way Frank had set up the sentence that she was not. Diane Marie Cole, age 65. Frank pulled up an insurance database record, the kind licensed investigators can access through approved channels. Her health insurance claims for the past 3 years show routine preventive care. Annual physical dental cleaning, 1 orthopedic consult for a knee issue that resolved with physical therapy. He looked at me steadily. There is no record of cardiac treatment, no cardiologist visits, no hospitalization for heart-related conditions, no prescription history consistent with congestive heart failure. The air went out of the room. Emily told me Diane had end-stage heart disease, I said. My voice cracked down the middle. She told me Diane needed stability because she might not have more than a year or 2. That was the reason Emily gave me for why Diane needed a permanent home. I know. Frank's voice was quiet but steady. There's one more thing about Diane. He pulled up the property record. 4 months ago, Diane Cole sold a home in Spokane, Washington. Sale price $180,000. He let that number sit for a moment. The proceeds didn't go toward a new property purchase. They didn't go into a savings or investment account. He found a wire transfer record. $160,000 was wired within 3 weeks of closing to a Kevin Cole Daniels' younger brother in Reno, Nevada. Gambling debts, I said. Nah, that would be my best read, yes. Frank closed the Diane file and opened one more window. And then there's this. He turned the laptop so I could see the screen, clearly my own credit card statement, the supplementary card I had approved for Emily 18 months ago, for what she called household management convenience. The charges loaded line by line, and my stomach dropped with each one. Total spend in the 3 months leading up to the wedding, $47,212. I leaned forward and read the line items. Wedding florist, $8,400. Catering deposit, final balance, $16,000. Venue booking, the Nines, Hotel Grand Ballroom, $11,200. Bridal gown alterations, accessories, $6,800. And on until the number at the bottom made my eyes sting. He posted on social media yesterday. Frank said, his voice hardening slightly, the closest thing to anger I had ever heard from him. He pulled up Daniel's public profile. The post showed the grand ballroom in full reception mode, chandeliers, blazing flowers on every table. The caption read, "Gave my bride the wedding she deserves. Spared no expense." I stared at that sentence until the words stopped meaning anything individually and just sat there as a mass of something foul. "Pshtank," I said, and my voice had gone somewhere very quiet and very certain, the way it used to go on job sites, when I found a structural problem that needed to be addressed before one more day of work went up on top of it. Pull the original deed for Hargrove Hill. Frank looked at me for a moment, then he typed. Already have it. He turned the screen. My name. Only my name. It's in your name only, Richard, sole owner. They cannot touch that property without your signature on a transfer document. Then my signature, I said, is the one thing they are never going to get. Frank had fallen asleep in the chair around 3 a.m, laptop, still open, external drives still running their backup. I had not slept at all. I sat on the edge of the bed with Margaret's cardigan across my lap and watched the Portland sky outside the window go from black to the particular shade of pewter gray that passes for dawn in October in this city. By 7, I had showered and dressed. By 8, I was on my 3rd cup of coffee from the hallway machine, which still tasted like hot brown regret, but had at least stopped surprising me about it. My phone rang at 8:47. The name on the screen made my hand go very still around the cup. Emily. She had not called Saturday night. She had not texted. She had not sent a single word in the 18 hours since Daniel had closed the door of my house in my face. But Monday morning, 8:47, she called. I pressed answer and brought the phone to my ear. Dad. Her voice was warm, softer than it had been in the corridor of the ballroom. The version of Emily that appeared when she needed something. Are you okay? I've been so worried about you. The pressure behind my eyes sharpened. I breathed through it carefully, the way you breathe through a load shift on a job site, steadily, so nothing else moves. I'm fine, Emily, I said. Where are you calling from? Home. A beat of hesitation. Hargrove Hill. I wanted to check in before the week gets busy. But before the week gets busy. My daughter hadn't checked on me in 18 hours after watching her husband close a door in my face, but she was calling now before the week got busy. I pressed my back teeth together and kept my voice level. That's kind of you, I said. Dad. I want you to know that Saturday was a lot. For everyone. Daniel and I talked last night, and we both agree that we want this transition to feel as comfortable as possible for you. Her voice had the cadence of something rehearsed sentences that had been arranged in a particular order before the call was made. We want you to feel included. Included, I repeated. Yes. Which is actually why I'm calling. The warmth shifted subtly like a thermostat clicking over. Daniel's lawyer has been drawing up some paperwork. Just a deed transfer, very standard, so we can start the renovation planning. The structural stuff, you know how that goes. Dad, you can't get contractor bids until the ownership is clear on paper. She gave a small laugh, the kind designed to make a complicated thing sound simple. It would mean so much if you could come by this week and just sign off. My jaw tightened so hard I felt it in my temples. A deed transfer. Just a deed transfer. The paperwork that would take my name off Hargrove Hill permanently and replace it with Daniel Coles, the man with the Nevada Shell Company, the 83% credit utilization, and the prior fraud complaint in King County, described as a formality to help with contractor bids. What kind of renovations? I asked. Just updates. Kitchen modernization, master suite refresh. She paused. Daniel thinks it'll significantly increase the market value. He has some partners who are very interested in the property's potential. There it was. Partners. The word landed like a pin through a blueprint marking exactly what Hargrove Hill was to Daniel Cole. Not a home, not a place where Margaret had planted an oak tree and knitted in the reading chair and raised our daughter on Sunday pancakes. It was a real estate asset. It was collateral. It was the centerpiece of a deal already in motion. Emily. I kept my voice even the way I kept my voice even on job sites when I found a problem that needed addressing before anyone else panicked. I need to ask you something directly. Of course, Dad. Anything. Did you know about Daniel's investment company before the wedding? The LLC he registered in Nevada. A pause. Short, but there. What does that have to do with the paperwork? I'd like you to answer the question. Daniel's business affairs are Dad. That's really between him and his partners. I don't think. Emily. My voice dropped half a register. Did you know? The warmth in her voice pulled back entirely now, and what replaced it was something careful and constructed. I think you need to trust that Daniel knows what he's doing. He's been in real estate for years. He understands how these structures work. Another pause, and then her voice tightened into something I hadn't heard from her since she was a teenager who had been caught in a lie and was calculating how to redirect. Dad, I need you to sign these papers. Daniel really needs this settled. His partners are waiting, and this is time-sensitive. Time-sensitive. There it was, the actual temperature of the call, stripped of the warmth and the concern and the, "I've been so worried about you." They needed my signature, and they needed it before something else moved, before a deal closed, before a partner walked. "Tell Daniel I'll be in touch," I said. "Dad, wait. Don't do this. Don't make this into something it isn't. Emily." My voice came out with a quietness that surprised even me, not cold, but final, the way a load-bearing calculation is final. There is no arguing with physics. "Tell Daniel I'll be in touch." I ended the call. For a long moment, I sat with the phone in my lap and the cardigan still across my knees and the gray Portland morning pressing against the window. My chest hurt in the particular way it had been hurting since Saturday. Not sharp, but deep, the kind of ache that sits in the bones rather than the muscles. Frank stirred in the chair across the room, blinking himself awake. He looked at the phone in my hand, and then at my face, and read both correctly. "She called," he said. Not a question. "She called." I set the phone on the bed. Frank, they have partners waiting on the property. Daniel is using Hargrove Hill as leverage on a deal. That's why they're pushing so hard and so fast." I looked at him. "We don't have weeks. We have days." Frank was already reaching for his laptop. "Then we move today," he said, voice sharp and awake now, sleep entirely gone from his face. "I need to make 2 calls, and you need to be ready to drive by this afternoon." "Drive where?" He looked at me over the top of the screen, and for the first time since Sunday morning, something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the particular look Frank Dalton got when a problem had just been handed a solution it didn't see coming. "Back to Hargrove Hill," he said. "I want to see what else they've changed. And more importantly, I want to see what they haven't." I called Emily back at noon and told her I'd come by that afternoon. I kept it simple, told her I had been thinking about what she said, that I wanted to see the house and talk properly, face to face. She sounded relieved in a way that made my stomach turn, because relief like that only exists when someone has been worried that their plan might not work. She told me to come at 2. She said she'd make coffee. I told Frank where I was going. He looked at me across the motel table with the particular expression he reserves for decisions he disagrees with, but respects. "You're walking into their house," he said. "It's my house," I said. "And I need to see what they haven't changed yet. You said so yourself." I picked up my jacket. "Keep the camera feed running. If anything goes sideways in there, you'll have it on record." Frank pulled up the live feed on his laptop without another word. That was Frank. He argued once, and then he got to work. Emily opened the front door before I reached the porch steps. She must have been watching from the window. She was dressed carefully, hair done, a smile arranged on her face that was working very hard to look natural. She hugged me at the door, and I hugged her back, because she was still my daughter, and my arms still remembered how to do that, even when my chest was full of concrete and broken glass. "Come in, Dad. I just put the coffee on." I stepped inside, and my feet stopped moving for just a moment before I forced them to continue. The foyer was different. The side table where Margaret had kept a ceramic bowl for keys and mail, a bowl she had bought at a craft fair in Astoria the summer Emily turned 12, was gone, replaced by a tall black coat rack with angular lines that belonged in a furniture catalog not in this house. The watercolor of the Columbia River Gorge that had hung above it for 22 years was gone too. In its place, a large abstract canvas in gray and gold that I had never seen before. "You've redecorated," I said. Emily touched the back of her neck. "Just some updates. The style needed freshening." She moved quickly toward the kitchen. "Coffee's almost ready. Come sit." I followed her through the living room. Margaret's sofa, the deep green one she had special ordered, and waited 11 weeks for, because the color had to be exactly right, was gone. A sleek gray sectional occupied its place, showroom clean, the kind that looks expensive in photographs and uncomfortable in person. Every surface had been wiped of anything that had accumulated meaning over 30 years. The bookshelves held new objects, geometric sculptures, a few hardcovers arranged by color rather than author. It looked like a staging job. It looked like someone preparing a property to sell. Diane was in the living room, installed in the reading chair, the same way she had been Saturday night, like she had always lived there. She looked up when I walked in and offered a smile that managed to be simultaneously welcoming and dismissive. "Richard." She set down her magazine. "How are you settling in? Are they taking good care of you at the facility?" I looked at her steadily. "I'm at a motel, Diane." "Oh." Her expression shifted through something too fast to read. "Well, that's temporary, of course. These things take a little time to arrange properly." She patted the arm of the chair, Margaret's chair, with a contentment so complete it turned my stomach. "It's a beautiful home. You must be so proud of what you built here." What I built here? In the chair, my wife had reupholstered herself with fabric she'd driven 2 hours to find. "Dad." Emily's voice came from the kitchen doorway. "Coffee's ready." I sat at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the mug Emily set in front of me, needing something solid to hold. Emily sat across from me, fingers laced around her own cup, and for a moment she almost looked like herself, the version of her I had raised uncertain and hopeful in equal measure. "I'm glad you came," she said. "I think we can work through this, Dad. I really do. If you just, Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and her expression flickered just for a second, a tightening around the eyes. "Sorry. Let me just 1 second." She stood, picked up the phone, and stepped into the hallway. I sat with my coffee. From where I was seated, I had a clear sight line to the hallway and to the partially open door of the master bedroom, at the far end, the room where Margaret and I had slept for 27 years. Daniel's voice reached me through that gap, low and certain, carrying the way voices carry through spaces with good acoustics. I had designed this house. I knew exactly how sound moved through it. "I didn't marry you for love, Emily." His voice was so flat, so matter-of-fact, that it took my brain an extra second to process the words. "I married you for that house. That was always the point." My hands tightened around the mug so hard the ceramic bit into my palms. Emily's voice, barely audible, shot through with panic. "Daniel, keep your voice down! My father is right!" "Your father is a 68-year-old man sitting in my kitchen," Daniel said. "And if you can't get him to sign those papers, then you've been useless to me since the ceremony ended. Is that clear?" His voice dropped further, colder. "Get back out there and fix this, or I swear to God, Emily, you'll be looking for somewhere to live too." A beat of terrible silence. Then Emily's voice, stripped of everything except the need to survive the next 5 minutes. "He'll sign. I'll make him sign." I set the mug down on the table. Very carefully, very deliberately. My hands were shaking, not from fear, not from anger, but from the particular tremor that comes when a structure you believed in gives way, and the ground beneath you is suddenly made of something entirely different than you thought. Emily came back into the kitchen 30 seconds later. Her smile was rebuilt, smoothed back into place, but her eyes were too bright, and her jaw was set at the angle it gets when she is holding something together by force of will alone. "Sorry about that," she said, settling back into her chair. "Where were we?" I looked at my daughter. The daughter I had driven to the emergency room, taught to parallel park held on the kitchen floor the night her mother died. I looked at her rebuilt smile and her two bright eyes, and I thought about what I had just heard through a partially open door, and I understood, with the cold clarity of a man who reads structural drawings for a living, that the damage in this house was not in the walls. We were talking about the future, I said. My voice came out even and steady. Tell me, Emily, what does yours look like exactly? She came on Wednesday, 2 days after I had sat at my own kitchen table and listened to her husband tell her, through a half-open door, that he had never loved her, and watched her rebuild her smile in 30 seconds and walk back in like nothing had happened. 2 days of no calls, no texts, nothing. Then Wednesday afternoon, 3 o'clock, a knock at my motel room door. Emily stood in the hallway, with a manila envelope pressed against her chest, and the particular expression she had worn at 16, whenever she wanted something she already knew she shouldn't ask for. Her hair was pulled back tightly. She was wearing the dove-gray blazer she saved for serious occasions. She had dressed for this the way you dress for a negotiation. She stepped inside without being invited the way she had done since she was old enough to reach the doorknob. I brought the paperwork. I think if we just sit down and go through it together, you'll see it's all very straightforward. She set the manila envelope on the table between us and sat down across from me, folding her hands on top of it, like she was chairing a meeting. Emily, I said, who drafted those documents? Daniel's attorney. He's very experienced in Oregon property law. Daniel's attorney, I repeated. I kept my voice measured the way I kept it measured on job sites, when a subcontractor tried to cut a corner and expected me not to notice. Not a neutral party. Not someone whose job is to protect your interests or mine. Daniel's attorney. A flash of irritation crossed her face and was controlled quickly. It's standard, Dad. This is how these things work. What's inside the envelope? She opened it herself, spreading 2 documents on the table with the practiced efficiency of someone who had reviewed them several times already. A deed transfer for Hargrove Hill and a durable power of attorney. The power of attorney is just so Daniel can manage the property logistics while the renovation is underway, contractor coordination, permit applications, that kind of thing. She slid the documents toward me. Once you sign, everything moves forward, and we can all stop living in this. She gestured vaguely at the motel room, limbo. I picked up the power of attorney and read it. I am not a lawyer, but I have been reading contracts for 30 years. Subcontractor agreements, supplier terms, city permit documentation, and I know what language that reaches too far looks like. This document, drafted on a letterhead I didn't recognize, granted Daniel Cole full and unlimited authority over all real and personal property belonging to Richard James Bennett, including but not limited to the right to sell, transfer, mortgage, or otherwise encumber said property without further consent. Without further consent. Not limited to renovation logistics. Not limited to permit applications. Full authority. No expiration. No conditions. The kind of document that once signed would allow Daniel to sell Hargrove Hill, mortgage it to the ceiling, or hand it to whoever his partners were, all without ever asking me again. My chest went cold and tight like a fist closing around my sternum. Emily? I set the document down flat on the table. This power of attorney gives Daniel unlimited legal authority over every asset I own. Not just the house. Everything. I looked straight at her. Did you read it before you brought it here? Her chin came up. I trust Daniel to handle the details. That's not what I asked. Her voice cracked slightly at the edges, the first real fracture I had heard from her in days. I need you to do this. Daniel has partners who are pulling out if the ownership isn't clear by the end of the week. Do you understand what that means? This is my marriage. This is my future. If you torpedo this deal, you're not just hurting Daniel, you're hurting me. The fracture in her voice widened as she kept talking, and underneath the pressure and the urgency, I could hear something that might have been real fear, not the performed kind she used when she needed something, but the kind that comes from a woman who had tied her future to a man who'd told her through a door that she was only useful as long as she delivered. "Sign the papers, Dad." Her voice dropped to something raw and insistent. "If you don't, you're the one destroying my marriage." "Is that the father you want to be?" I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the Willamette River was running gray-green under a sky the color of old pewter, and a cargo barge was making its slow way south. I breathed through the tightness in my chest and thought about every document I had ever signed, every contract, every permit, every closing statement, and the rule I had followed for 30 years without exception. Never sign anything you haven't read completely, and never sign anything that gives someone else unlimited authority over what you built. I turned back to face her. "Leave the envelope," I said. "I'll have someone look at it." Emily shot to her feet, color flooding her face. "There is nothing to look at. It is a standard document, and you are making this into something it is not because you cannot stand the idea of—" "Emily." My voice came out quiet and final. "Leave the envelope." She stared at me for 3 full seconds, chest-heaving eyes bright with unshed tears that might have been genuine. I couldn't tell anymore, and that was the saddest thing I had learned all week. Then she snatched up her bag, left the envelope on the table, and walked out without closing the door behind her. I listened to her heels on the hallway floor until the elevator took her. Then I sat back down, picked up the power of attorney, and read every word of it again from the beginning. Then I called Frank. "She came," I said. "Frank, if I had signed this, I would have handed him everything. Every account, every decision, permanently." Frank's voice on the other end was steady and grim. "I know. Rich, it's time to call Harold. Harold Spence had handled Margaret's estate when she died 12 years ago. He was 71 now, semi-retired in the way that certain men are semi-retired, meaning he kept an office on the 14th floor of a building on Southwest Broadway. Mostly because, as he had told me once over coffee sitting at home, made him feel like he was already dead. He answered when I called at 7 Thursday morning and told me to come in at 9. When I arrived, he was already at his desk with a legal pad, 2 cups of coffee, and the focused stillness of a man who had seen enough to know when something was serious before he was told. I set the manila envelope on his desk. He opened it without speaking, pulled out both documents, and read them with the unhurried attention of someone who understood that speed and thoroughness were enemies of each other. 4 minutes passed. I drank my coffee and did not interrupt. Harold set the power of attorney down first. He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "Whoever drafted this is not an amateur," he said. "This language is deliberately broad. Full and unlimited authority with no sunset clause, no condition, no asset carve-out." He tapped the page. "If you had signed this, Richard Daniel Cole would have had the legal ability to sell every asset you own, including Hargrove Hill mortgage it, above its value transfer it to a third party, or gift it to whoever he pleased, all without consulting you, all without your knowledge, and all entirely within the law." My jaw tightened until it ached. "Is there anything illegal about the document itself?" "Not a thing. That's what makes it effective." Harold set it aside and looked at the deed transfer. "This one is simpler. Standard form, correctly executed, all it needs is your signature and notarization, and Hargrove Hill transfers out of your name permanently." He looked at me. Did you sign either of these? No. He exhaled slowly, and I could see genuine relief move across his face. Good. Then we are in a strong position. He leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together. Richard, what do you want to happen here? I need to understand your objective before I tell you what's available. I want Hargrove Hill to stay mine, I said. I want Daniel Cole to have no legal claim to it, no path to it, and no leverage over it. And I want it done before the end of this week because he has partners waiting on the property and whatever deal he's running is on a timeline. Harold looked at me for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression, a sharpening the way a contractor's face changes when a problem resolves into something solvable. Then here is what I suggest, he said, leaning forward. You place a voluntary mortgage on Hargrove Hill today. $800,000 through a bank I trust properly recorded with Multnomah County. He held up a hand before I could speak. The money doesn't go anywhere. A voluntary mortgage, sometimes called a protective lien, creates a recorded encumbrance on the property title. In plain language, so it means that anyone looking at a title search will see that Hargrove Hill carries $800,000 in debt. Any partner Daniel has brought in to invest based on the property's equity will see that the collateral they were counting on is already spoken for. I stared at him. And it's completely legal. You own the property free and clear. You have every right to encumber it as you choose. This is not a trick, it is a legitimate instrument used routinely in asset protection. Harold picked up his pen. What it will do if Daniel is using Hargrove Hill as a promise to his investors is pull the floor out from under the deal. The question then becomes what Daniel does when the prize he's been advertising disappears. The answer to that question arrived in my chest, like a stone dropping through still water. I already knew what Daniel would do. I had heard it through a half-open door he would turn on Emily. He would fold the hand. He would cut her loose the same way he had done to Sandra Merritt in Seattle. Do it, I said. Harold was already reaching for his phone. I'll have the bank contact by noon. The lien will be recorded with the county by end of business today. He paused with the receiver in his hand. Richard, there's one more thing. Once this is done, I'd strongly recommend you tell Emily about the mortgage before Daniel finds out through another channel. Let her hear it from you in your words. Why? Harold set the receiver down for a moment and looked at me directly. Because how she reacts when the money disappears will tell you everything you need to know about what you're dealing with. If she calls you in concern, there may still be something salvageable. If the first call you get is from Daniel, he left it there. By 4 o'clock Thursday afternoon, Harold's office had confirmed the protective mortgage on Hargrove Hill was recorded with Multnomah County, $800,000, properly executed, fully legal, fully visible, on any title search. The equity Daniel had been promising his partners had ceased to exist on paper. At 6 o'clock, I called Emily. I kept my voice tired and slow, the voice of a man carrying something heavy he had been holding too long. Emily. I said, before we talk about any paperwork, there's something about the house you need to know. She went quiet on the other end. I told her about the mortgage. I told her it had been in place for some time, that I had kept it private, that I was sorry she hadn't known sooner. Every word was chosen carefully, the way you choose where to place weight on an uncertain surface. When I finished, the line stayed quiet for 3 long seconds. Then Emily said she had to go. She hung up without another word. I set the phone on the nightstand and folded my hands in my lap and waited. Because Harold had been exactly right. The first call I got next would tell me everything. I had been awake since 5. Not from anxiety, I had moved past anxiety sometime around Wednesday night. and arrived at something colder and clearer, a place where the path forward was visible, even if the walking was hard. I was on my second cup of hallway machine coffee when my phone lit up on the nightstand at 7:15 Friday morning. The name on the screen was not Emily. It was Daniel. That single fact told me more than anything he was about to say. A husband who had just learned difficult news about his wife's family calls his wife. A man running a transaction calls the obstacle directly. I picked up on the third ring. "Good morning, Daniel." No greeting came back. His voice arrived stripped of every social layer he had ever put between himself and what he actually was. No warmth, no patience, no carefully managed smile audible in his tone. Just flat, cold demand. "Is it true the house is mortgaged?" "I've owned Hargrove Hill for 29 years, Daniel." I kept my voice the way Harold had kept his, in the office level, unhurried, giving nothing away for free. Financial situations change over time. "How much?" His voice tightened like a cable under load. 800,000, is that the number? "That's the recorded amount, yes." A sound came through the line that wasn't quite a word. Something between a breath and a curse swallowed before it finished forming. Then, why didn't Emily tell me this before the wedding? "You'd have to ask Emily that question. I'm asking you." The pretense of civility was completely gone, now burned off like morning fog the moment real heat arrived. His voice dropped to something I had not heard from him before, raw, exposed, furious, in the way that men get furious when they realize a calculation they were certain of has failed. "Do you have any idea what I've put into this, what I've committed to? I have partners who've been waiting on the equity position in that property for months." Months, Richard. My chest stayed absolutely still. I breathed through it and let him keep going, because a man speaking from this place, cornered, exposed, not yet recalculated, will tell you everything if you give him enough room. I gave up other opportunities for this," Daniel said, his voice fracturing slightly at the edge. "I had other options. Better options, maybe. I chose this situation because the numbers made sense. Because Emily told me." He stopped himself. Reset. When he came back, his voice had gone somewhere colder and more deliberate. "This changes everything. You understand that?" "I understand that your plans have been affected," I said carefully. "I'm sorry to hear that." A beat of silence. Not the contemplative kind, but the kind that happens when someone realizes the person they're speaking to is not going to react the way they expected, and they need to recalibrate. "This isn't over," Daniel said. His voice had gone flat and final, like a door closing on a room you're not being invited back into. "You think you've protected yourself. You haven't. There are other ways to get what I'm owed." "What you're owed?" I repeated quietly. He hung up. I set the phone down on the nightstand and pressed both palms flat against my knees. My heart was beating harder than I wanted it to, and my jaw ached from holding it steady through that entire call. I breathed deliberately in for 4 counts, out for 4, the way Margaret had taught me after my first cardiac scare at 61, when the doctor told me stress was doing things to my body I couldn't see yet. I had held myself together through that call, but the words were still in the room with me. Partners waiting on the equity position. Other options. What I'm owed. He had never seen Hargrove Hill as Emily's inheritance. He had never seen it as our family's home. He had walked into that wedding with a balance sheet already drawn up, and my daughter's love had been a line item on it. 40 minutes later, Emily called. She was crying before she finished saying my name, not the performed, pressurized tears of the woman who had brought me the envelope on Wednesday, but something rawer and more desperate, the kind of crying that comes from a place that has no strategy left. Dad, Daniel told me he wants a divorce. Her voice broke apart on the last word and reassembled itself jaggedly. He said I misled him. He said he married me with the understanding that the house was part of the arrangement, and now there's no arrangement, and he... She stopped, pulled a ragged breath, pushed forward. He told me to pack a bag, Dad. He told me to pack a bag and figure out somewhere to go. My throat tightened so hard it hurt to swallow. He said... Her voice dropped to something that nearly destroyed me, not because of what she said, but because of how young she sounded. Saying it the way she had sounded at 9 years old, calling me from a friend's house because she was scared and wanted to come home. He said the house is in his name now through a post-nuptial agreement I signed 2 weeks before the wedding. He called it a prenuptial agreement, but told me it was just a standard financial planning document, something about taxes and asset protection, and I trusted him, and now he says I have no claim to it, and that I should have thought about what I was signing up for before. She broke off, entirely crying too hard to finish the sentence. Emily. I pressed my free hand flat against my sternum, against the ache that had lived there since Saturday. Where are you right now? I'm in the car. A shuddering breath. I'm in the parking lot of the Safeway on Barber. I didn't know where else to go. The Safeway on Barber Boulevard. She had gone to a grocery store parking lot because she had no map for this moment, no plan, no script, no envelope full of documents telling her what to do next. She was 38 years old, sitting in a car in a parking lot because the man she had bent herself into a shape she didn't recognize to please had just told her she was no longer useful. What did you do, Dad? Her voice came out wrecked and accusatory and heartbroken all at the same time. Why did you tell him about the mortgage? You knew what would happen. I pressed harder against my chest. I protected what's mine, Emily, I said. The same way I always have. She was still crying when I ended the call. I sat for a long time after phone in my lap room, quiet around me except for the muffled sound of the street below. Then I called Frank. Phase 1 worked, I said. But Emily's been cut loose. Whatever Daniel does next, he won't do it quietly and he won't do it slowly. We need to move. Frank called me at 2 that afternoon. He had been running the camera feed all morning from the motel, and his voice when he called carried the particular flatness of someone who had watched something he wished he hadn't. Rich, he said. Emily just came out with bags. Daniel changed the door code while she was inside. She's sitting on the front steps outside the gate. A pause. She's been out there for 20 minutes. I was in my car and moving before he finished the sentence. I told myself I was going because she was still my daughter. I told myself I needed to see her face, the real one, not the performed versions she had been offering me since Saturday. Part of me knew that both things were true. Part of me knew there was a third reason I couldn't fully name yet, something that had to do with a conversation that had been building since the night I found Margaret's ring in a trash bin, and that was going to happen today, whether I was ready for it or not. Hargrove Hill looked ordinary from the street. That was the thing that got me pulling up 2 houses down, how ordinary it looked. October afternoon, amber light coming through the oak tree Margaret had planted, a few leaves drifting across the front walk. From outside, you would never know that the woman who had grown up in that house was sitting on the curb beside it, with 2 suitcases and a carry-on bag, mascara dried in tracks down her face. Emily looked up when she heard my car door. She was in the dove gray blazer again, the one she had worn to bring me the documents on Wednesday, now crumpled and pulled at the collar like she had been gripping it. Her eyes were swollen from crying that had been going on for hours. Dad. Her voice came out scraped and hollow, the voice of someone who has burned through every reserve of composure and arrived at the raw material underneath. I walked toward her and stopped a few feet away. The oak tree moved overhead in the afternoon wind, and a handful of amber leaves came down between us. "He locked me out," she said. She spread her hands toward the bags beside her, a gesture that was somehow more devastating than words. The entirety of her life in that house reduced to what could be packed in an afternoon. "He said the house is in his name through a document I signed at some point." "I don't even remember signing it, Dad. He had so many papers and I trusted him, and now he says I have no claim and I have nowhere." Her voice fractured completely, and she pressed both hands over her mouth to hold the sound in shoulders shaking. I stood in front of my daughter and let her cry. My chest hurt so badly I had to work to keep my breathing even. This was not performed. This was not the strategic Emily who had brought a manila envelope to my motel room or called me at 8:47 with warm, rehearsed concern. This was a woman who had walked into a fire thinking she knew the layout of the building and had found herself with no way out. Emily dropped her hands from her mouth, and her face went through something, grief cycling into blame in the way that grief often does when it needs somewhere to go. "This is your fault," she said. Her voice gained an edge as she said it, the tears still coming but something harder moving underneath them now. "You told him about the mortgage. You scared him off deliberately. You've been trying to destroy this from the beginning, because you can't stand anyone else having a say in that house. It's always been yours, every decision, every—" "Emily." My voice was quiet, but it stopped her. "No." She took a step toward me, and the grief had fully converted now into something fiercer, something that needed a target. "Daniel was going to give us a real future, a real life. And you couldn't let that happen because you are the most selfish, controlling Emily." I said it again, same volume, same register. "He left me because of you." Her voice broke into a full cry, again, fists clenched at her sides, chest heaving. "Everything I had is gone, and it is because you couldn't sign 2 pieces of paper, because you had to be right, because your pride matters more than my happiness, more than my marriage, more than—" She stopped. Her face contorted with something terrible and desperate and lost. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something barely above a breath, and yet it landed on me harder than anything else that had happened since Saturday. "Why couldn't it have been you who died instead of Mom?" The words went into me the way structural failure goes into a building not immediately visible, but catastrophic at the load-bearing level. My vision didn't blur. My legs didn't buckle. I stood absolutely still in the October afternoon with the oak tree moving overhead and my daughter's face in front of me, and those words between us hanging in the air like smoke from something that had already burned all the way down. Emily's expression changed the moment the words were out, horror chasing across her face, the instant, unbearable recognition of something that cannot be unsaid. Her hand went to her mouth. "Dad, I didn't—" "I know," I said. And my voice, to my own surprise, came out steady, not cold, not punishing. Steady the way a structure is steady when it has been built correctly from the foundation and has been carrying weight long enough to know how. I turned and walked back to my car. Not fast, not dramatically. 1 foot in front of the other, the way I had walked across 1,000 job sites in 30 years, the way you walk when the work is serious and you need everything you have for what comes next. I got in, closed the door, and put both hands on the wheel. Outside, Emily stood where I had left her. One hand still pressed to her mouth, the oak tree dropping leaves around her in the afternoon wind. My chest was in agony, not anger, not yet, maybe not ever. Something deeper and older and harder to name than anger. Something that had been there since I found a shoebox of Margaret's things in a trash bin and understood what kind of love I was dealing with. I sat with both hands on the wheel for a long time. Then I pulled out my phone and called Frank. "I know what I'm going to do," I said. "All of it. Are you ready?" Frank didn't ask what I meant. "Tell me when," he said. "I've spent 30 years building things meant to last. And I have learned over those 30 years that the most dangerous moment in any project is not when something goes wrong. It is the weekend before the final pour, when everything is in place, the forms are set, the rebar is tied, and all that remains is the decision to commit to the structure you have designed. That weekend, Frank and Harold and I built something different. But the principle was exactly the same. Harold's office on Saturday morning smelled of old books and the particular brand of dark roast coffee he had been ordering from the same small batch roaster in Northwest Portland for 15 years. He poured 3 cups without asking and spread everything across the conference table: Frank's printed surveillance reports, the camera footage, transcripts, the credit card statements, Daniel's background file, Diane's insurance records, the LLC registration, and the recorded mortgage from Multnomah County. Harold looked at the table for a long moment. Then he said, "Richard, you have more here than most civil attorneys see in a case that goes to trial." Frank set his coffee down. "We have fraud-adjacent behavior, financial misrepresentation, unauthorized use of a supplementary credit card, and conspiracy to deprive a property owner of his assets through deception." He looked at Harold. "Chargeable, borderline on criminal, very strong on civil." Harold pressed 2 fingers to his temple. "But before we discuss what you could pursue, I need to know what you actually want. Because there's a version of this that drags through Oregon courts for 2 years and costs you significant money even if you win. And there's a version that ends it cleanly and quickly." He looked at me over his glasses. "Which one?" I looked at the table covered in evidence of the last 3 weeks of my life. "The second one," I said. "Clean, fast, finished." Harold nodded like he had expected exactly that answer. "Then here's the architecture." He picked up his pen. "Daniel and Diane are currently occupying a property they have no legal right to occupy. The recorded mortgage removes any equity argument they might make. The camera footage, the credit card records, and the LLC background give us leverage to ensure they cooperate rather than litigate." He tapped the pen against the table. "We do this in 2 stages. First, we wait for Diane to do exactly what Frank tells me she's planning to do." Frank pulled up his phone and showed me a screenshot from the home network activity logs, still running on my account, still entirely accessible. Diane had been using the house Wi-Fi to send messages through her phone, and the traffic had flagged her plan clearly enough. "Come Saturday next week. Housewarming. Daniel has done so much with the place. You have to see it." She had sent it to Daniel's aunt and 3 cousins since Thursday. A housewarming party. In my house. With my oak tree in the backyard, and Margaret's garden beds ripped out, and Diane's catering order placed through an account she didn't own. "She's inviting the entire family to celebrate moving in," Frank said, and his voice was very dry. "Let her," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt, because what I felt was a coldness in my chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with clarity. "Let her set the table. We'll arrive for dessert." Harold's mouth moved in the direction of approval. "Stage 2, I have already reached out to 2 officers at the Portland Police Bureau's Civil Matters Unit. They are familiar with trespass enforcement on contested properties. With your recorded ownership documents and the protective mortgage, they will have everything they need to execute a formal notice of unlawful occupancy." "And the recordings?" I asked. Frank reached into his case and produced a Bluetooth speaker, compact matte black, about the size of a shoebox. "Oregon is a one-party consent state," he said. meaning a recording is admissible if at least one party to the conversation knew it was being recorded. You installed the system in your own home. Every recording is clean. He set the speaker on the table. Every person in that driveway will hear exactly what Daniel Cole said about his wife and his father-in-law. The room stayed charged for a moment. Then Harold looked at me. Richard, I need to ask you one more thing. The house itself. What do you want to do with it after? I'd been thinking about this since Friday afternoon, sitting in the car with my hands on the wheel and the oak tree dropping leaves outside. The answer had arrived the way answers arrive when you have stopped fighting what you already know. There's a developer who has been making offers on Hargrove Hill for 2 years, I said. Marcus Webb. Every time he called, I said no. I want you to call him Monday morning. Harold raised his eyebrows. You're certain? I thought about Margaret's curtains replaced by gray geometric panels. I thought about the bowl from Astoria sitting in a landfill somewhere. I thought about the reading chair. Call him, I said. Tell him cash offer 30-day close and I need a letter of intent signed by Sunday. Harold was reaching for his phone before I finished the sentence. Frank was already closing the surveillance file, moving to the next phase with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting for the plan to solidify. I sat in Harold's leather chair and wrapped both hands around my coffee cup, which had gone cold. Harold hung up the phone and looked at me with something close to satisfaction. Marcus Webb says he'll have the letter of intent signed by Sunday morning. He didn't even negotiate the price. He's been waiting 2 years, I said. He has. Harold refilled my cup from the carafe. Everything is in place, Richard. All we need now is for Diane to do exactly what she's already planned to do. He settled back in his chair. In my experience, people who are certain they've won stop paying attention. And that, he said, picking up his own cup, is when they make the mistakes that matter. Frank had the camera feed running by noon. I sat in my car 2 blocks from Hargrove Hill with his laptop open on the passenger seat, watching the screen. The way I used to watch weather reports before outdoor pours, looking for the exact moment conditions would either hold or break. By 12:30, a catering van had pulled into my driveway. By 1, there were flower arrangements going through the front door. Not the garden roses Emily and I had discussed for the wedding that turned out to be billed to my card, but something more aggressive. Birds of paradise and white orchids, the kind you order when you want a room to look expensive rather than loved. She ordered catering, I said. Frank, on the phone from his own car parked further down the street, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. And a bartender, and a photo backdrop for the entryway. A photo backdrop for a housewarming party at my house, for a home Diane Cole had been living in for 11 days. By 2 o'clock, the first cars arrived. I watched on the camera feed as Diane stood in the doorway of my house. Margaret's house in a silk blouse and the pearl necklace greeting each arrival with the expansive warmth of a woman in her natural element. She kissed cheeks. She gestured toward the interior with the proprietary sweep of someone conducting a tour. She laughed at things people said and touched arms and patted hands and looked in every possible way, like she had always lived there. Daniel worked the room behind her jacket on glass of something amber in his hand. I watched him guide a heavy-set man in his 50s toward the back windows. The man had the posture of someone used to making decisions about property. Daniel pointed toward the backyard, where Margaret's garden beds had been torn out, and the heavy-set man nodded and made a note on his phone. My jaw tightened so hard my back teeth ached. Frank, I said. The man Daniel's showing the backyard to. Can you get a clear frame? A pause. Got it. Running it now. Another pause longer. Rich, that's the same man from the King County civil dispute. the one who represented the investment group in the Seattle case. He's Daniel's money man. So Daniel had not only continued the deal after the mortgage, he had brought his partner here, to my house, to show him the renovation potential of a property Daniel did not own, using a gathering that Diane had organized to provide cover and credibility. The audacity of it landed on me like a structural load I hadn't calculated for, staggering for just a second before I found my footing again. "How many people are in there?" I asked. "Camera count is 18, maybe 20. I looked at my watch. 2:58. Harold and the two officers from the Portland Police Bureau Civil Unit were parked on the next block over, waiting for my text. Marcus Webb's signed letter of intent was in the folder on the back seat. The recorded mortgage documentation was in Harold's briefcase. Everything that needed to be in place was in place. On the laptop screen, Diane was leading a group of women through the living room, gesturing at the gray sectional, the abstract canvas, the geometric sculptures on the shelves. I could not hear what she was saying, but I could read it in her posture. Every movement spoke of ownership, of arrival, of a woman who had finally gotten the life she believed she deserved. Then the camera caught her in the kitchen doorway, and this time the audio was clear enough. My son worked so hard for this beautiful home. We are just so incredibly blessed." She pressed one hand to her chest and looked around the kitchen with eyes that had gone soft and grateful. "Daniel gave up so much to make this happen. This family deserves every bit of this." The man beside her murmured something admiring. Diane smiled the smile of a woman who has never been caught at anything in her life and sees no reason to start worrying now. I texted Harold 2 words. "Come now." I closed the laptop. I got out of the car. The October afternoon had gone cool and gray, the kind of afternoon that smells like rain coming in off the Coast Range, and the oak tree at the front of my property was moving in the wind, dropping leaves across the walk, the same way it had been dropping leaves since Margaret planted it 38 years ago. I buttoned my jacket. I picked up the folder from the back seat. I heard the squad car door open behind me and Harold's footsteps on the pavement to my right, and I walked toward my front gate with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who had built things designed to stand for 100 years and was not afraid of what he was about to do. "Ready?" Harold said beside me, his own folder tucked under his arm. I looked at the house through the gate, the lights in the windows, the shadows of people moving inside the photo backdrop Diane had installed in my entryway to commemorate her arrival in someone else's life. "I've been ready," I said, "since the morning I found my wife's ring in a trash can." I opened the gate and walked in. The front door was unlocked. A catering staff member was coming out with an empty tray as I was going in, and she held the door for me with the automatic courtesy of someone focused on her next task. I thanked her and stepped inside my own house for the first time in 2 weeks. The entryway hit me first. Diane had installed a photo backdrop along the wall where Margaret's watercolor of the Columbia River Gorge had hung for 22 years. White fabric printed with the words, "Home is where the heart is," in flowing gold script. Guests had been taking photos in front of it. I could see the marks where people had stood. I breathed through the tightness in my chest and kept walking. The living room was full. 18 people, maybe 20, clustered in conversation groups around the gray sectional and the new furniture I had never chosen. Catering staff moved through with trays of appetizers. Someone had connected a speaker to what sounded like a curated playlist, soft jazz, the kind designed to make rooms feel warmer than they are. Diane saw me first. She was mid-sentence to a woman in a red cardigan, one hand raised in an illustrative gesture, and then her eyes found me across the room and her hand stopped in the air, and her face went through 5 expressions in about 2 seconds. Surprise, confusion, calculation, recovery, and then the bright, social smile that snapped back into place the way a screen door snaps shut in a draft. "Richard." She said it warmly, like I was a neighbor who had wandered in. What a surprise. Good afternoon, Diane." I kept my voice even and carried it clearly enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear. "I'm Richard Bennett. This is my home." The room shifted. Conversations dropped in volume. The woman in the red cardigan looked between me and Diane with the expression of someone recalibrating what kind of party she had arrived at. Daniel came out of the kitchen doorway with his glass still in his hand and his jacket still perfectly buttoned. When he saw me, his face did something I had never seen it do before. It went completely still, every performed expression suspended a wall with nothing behind it. He crossed the room in 6 strides, and his voice when he reached me was barely above a murmur. "What are you doing here, Richard?" Not a question. A warning issued quietly enough that only I could hear it. Harold stepped through the front door behind me and spoke at full conversational volume, addressing the room as much as Daniel. "Mr. Cole, I'm Harold Spence, attorney for Richard Bennett. This is a notice of trespass and unlawful occupancy." He extended the document toward Daniel with the steady hand of a man who had done this before. "Mr. Bennett is the sole recorded legal owner of this property. The protective mortgage filed with Multnomah County this week confirms that no equity transfer has occurred. You have 1 hour to gather personal belongings." Daniel's jaw tightened so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. He took the document and looked at it, and I watched his eyes move across the language fast, then slower, then stopping. His face went from stone to something worse than stone, the particular gray of a man watching a structure he built collapse in real time. "This is insane," he said, his voice climbing out of the murmur he'd been using. "We have an arrangement this was agreed upon. Produce a signed deed transfer," Harold said calmly. "If you have one, we'll review it on the spot." Daniel looked at Harold, then at me. His business partner, the heavy-set man from King County, had appeared in the kitchen doorway and was watching the exchange with the focused attention of someone doing rapid financial reassessment. Daniel turned toward him slightly, some automatic instinct to manage the optics, and the man took 1 step back and pulled out his phone. 2 uniformed officers stepped through the front door. One addressed the room clearly and without apology. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to need everyone to step outside while we process a property matter. Thank you for your cooperation." The room erupted into the particular murmur of 20 people who had all arrived expecting wine and canapes and were now being asked to leave. The woman in the red cardigan set her glass down and reached for her coat. The business partner was already moving toward the door phone pressed to his ear. Diane stepped forward from the corner where she had been standing, and her voice when she spoke had lost all its performance. It was small and genuinely frightened for the first time I had ever heard. Daniel. Just his name. Her eyes were wide. "Daniel, what is happening?" Daniel turned to her, and the mask was gone entirely. Now no charm, no management, no carefully maintained warmth. His face was the face of a man calculating his losses. "Go get your things, Mom," he said tightly. "Just go get your things." I stood in the center of my living room and watched the guests file out past Harold and the officers. One of Daniel's uncles caught my eye near the door and looked away quickly, not angry, just ashamed, the look of a man who has just understood something about his nephew. He would rather not have learned at a housewarming party. Daniel turned back to me when the room had mostly cleared. The business partner was gone. The catering staff had stopped moving. His voice dropped to something stripped and direct. "You'll regret this, Richard." I looked at him. Not with anger, I want to be clear about that, because what I felt in that moment was not anger. It was the quiet, weight-bearing steadiness of a man who has done the math correctly and knows it. I already have enough regrets, Daniel, I said. You're not going to be one of them. The guests had gathered on the front lawn in clusters, the way people cluster when something has disrupted the social script, and nobody is quite sure what the new one is. Some were on their phones. Some were talking in low, uncomfortable voices. A few had already made their way to their cars, which I took as the reasonable response of people who had come for wine and light appetizers and were not prepared for a property dispute. I texted Frank 2 words. Come now. His car rounded the corner in under 3 minutes. He parked at the curb, got out, and lifted the matte black Bluetooth speaker from his back seat with the unhurried efficiency of a retired contractor who has carried heavier things in worse weather. He set it on the roof of his car, connected his phone, and looked at me across the lawn. Volume, he said. Loud enough that no one has to strain, I said. Frank nodded and pressed play. Daniel's voice came through the speaker. First clear, unmistakable, the same voice that had shaken hands with every person on this lawn and smiled at their children and told them what a beautiful home it was going to be. Except now it was the voice from the kitchen camera on Saturday night, stripped of every layer of performance, saying the thing he had said when he thought no one who mattered was listening. Old men always come around when the alternative is sitting in a motel room with no one to talk to. Someone in the crowd made a sharp sound, not quite a gasp, something more involuntary than that. Then Emily's voice, equally clear. He's easy to manage. Once the deed is signed, cheapest nursing home we can find. A few $100 a month and we never have to think about him again. A woman near the back of the group pressed both hands over her mouth. One of Daniel's uncles, the same man who had looked away from me in the doorway, turned away from the speaker entirely, his shoulders dropping in a way that told me everything about how he felt, without him needing to say a word. Daniel came through the front door at a pace that was just short of running, and his face, when he saw the speaker on Frank's car roof, went from white to a deep, ugly red. Turn that off. He crossed the lawn toward Frank with his hand out, fingers pointing, voice vibrating with barely controlled fury. Turn it off right now. The officer standing nearest the driveway stepped smoothly into Daniel's path. Sir, please stay on the porch. Daniel pulled up short, chest-heaving hands, clenching at his sides. The recording kept going. His own voice continued from the speaker, the version from Friday morning's phone call. I have partners who've been waiting on the equity position in that property for months. I gave up other opportunities for this. Then, the recording from the bedroom, the one Richard had heard through the half-open door, the one that had settled into his bones and not left since Monday. I didn't marry you for love, Emily. I married you for that house. That was always the point. The lawn went very quiet. Not the polite quiet of people being careful, the stunned quiet of people who have just heard something they cannot unhear. Diane had come out through the front door behind Daniel and was standing on the porch steps. She was holding her pearl necklace with both hands, working it between her fingers, the way a person works a rosary when they need something to hold on to. I watched her face as she listened to her son's voice coming out of that speaker. I watched the warmth drain out of it. I watched the performance fall away, not replaced by grief, not replaced by shock, but by something more complicated and more honest recognition. She had known Daniel a long time. Some part of her had always known. Once the deed is signed, we drop the old man at the cheapest nursing home we can find. A few $100 a month, and we're free of him. Diane's hands dropped from the necklace. She stepped down off the porch and walked across the lawn, not toward me, not toward Daniel, but toward the street. Toward her own separate future, whatever that was going to look like now. Daniel turned toward her and something cracked open in his voice for the first time. Mom, don't. She said it without stopping, without turning around. One syllable, quiet and absolute, and then she kept walking. I watched her reach the sidewalk. I watched Daniel watch her go, and for one unguarded second, his face showed something I had never seen on it before. Not anger, not calculation, just the stunned expression of a man who had believed his mother would always be on his side and had just discovered there were conditions. Frank reached over and turned off the speaker. The remaining guests dispersed quickly and quietly, the way people leave when a party has become something they don't want to be associated with. Daniel stood alone in the driveway of my house with his hands at his sides, and the October wind moving through the oak tree above him, dropping leaves around his feet. I looked at him standing there. Then I turned to Harold. "One more thing to do," I said. Harold patted the folder under his arm. "Marcus Webb is standing by," he said. "Whenever you're ready." Harold had Marcus Webb on the phone before Daniel's car was out of the driveway. The offer had been standing for 2 years. $1,350,000, cash, 30-day close. Harold told him we needed final signatures Sunday afternoon. Webb said he'd have his attorney at Harold's office by 2. I sat across from Harold in his conference room that Saturday night and signed my name to the sale agreement 1 page at a time. Harold checked each page before I turned it. Neither of us rushed. I stopped at the last page. My pen hovered over the signature line. "Margaret picked the kitchen tiles," I said. "She stood on a step stool to reach the high shelf the day we moved in. I stood underneath her with my arms out in case she fell." My voice came out rougher than I intended. She never fell. Harold looked at me steadily over his glasses. "You don't owe me an explanation, Richard." "I know." I signed. I set the pen down and pushed the page across the table. I just needed to say it out loud one more time. Sunday morning, Marcus Webb arrived with 2 attorneys and a bank confirmation. The paperwork was complete by 11. Webb shook my hand at the door, firm, respectful, the handshake of a man who understood he was receiving something that had cost more than money. "We'll take good care of it, Mr. Bennett," he said. I looked at him. "It's yours now," I said. "Do what you need to do." Webb's moving crew arrived at noon. Daniel still had belongings inside clothing furniture he had brought in Diane's boxes stacked in the guest room. The crew moved it all to the front curb with the impersonal efficiency of people doing a job, not making a judgment. Box by box, bag by bag. Diane's silk blouses in a garbage bag. Daniel's leather weekend case. The photo backdrop with its gold script letters folded and left on top of the pile. The Portland sky had gone the color of pewter by early afternoon, and by 2 o'clock, the first drops of rain were coming down slow and cold, the kind of October rain that doesn't announce itself before it soaks through everything. I was standing across the street watching the last of the boxes come out when a taxi pulled up to the curb. The door opened and Emily stepped out. She looked at the pile of belongings on the sidewalk. She looked at the moving crew going back inside. She looked at the front gate, which now had a Webb Properties management notice attached to it. Her face went through everything, shock, comprehension, grief, and then her eyes found me across the street, and she crossed toward me in the rain without bothering to pull her collar up. "A dad." Her voice was wrecked, barely held together. "Please, I have nothing." Daniel cleared the joint account Thursday morning, every dollar gone. I have nowhere to go. She stopped in front of me, rain beginning to darken her hair, her shoulders, her blazer. "I know what I said to you. I know. But I am your daughter. I am the only thing you have left of this family." My chest hurt so badly I had to breathe through it in measured counts. I thought about 38 years, about the fever at 2 in the morning, and the parking lot in the rain, and the kitchen floor the night Margaret stopped breathing. Then I thought about the shoebox in the trash bin. and the 7 words she had said at the gate on Friday that I would carry for the rest of my life. I opened the car door and got in. Emily stepped toward the window, rain running freely down her face, now one hand raised toward the glass. "Dad, please!" I put both hands on the wheel. I looked straight ahead at the rain coming down on the street where I had lived for 29 years. Then I turned and looked at my daughter through the wet glass, really looked at her, and I felt the full weight of everything that had been lost between us pressing down on my sternum like a structural load that could not be redistributed. I didn't drive away yet. There was still one thing I needed to say. And it couldn't be said through glass. I opened the car door. Not to let her in. To say what needed to be said, standing up in the rain, face to face, the way serious things deserve to be said. Emily's eyes went wide when I stepped out. Hope moved across her face so fast it hurt to watch. Because hope like that belongs to someone who still believes the outcome can be changed. I stood in front of my daughter in the October rain and looked at her. Really looked at her the way I hadn't let myself fully look since the wedding. The mascara running in thin, dark lines down her cheeks. The blazer soaked through at the shoulders. The way her hands were shaking at her sides, fingers opening and closing like she didn't know what to do with them. "Emily!" My voice came out steady. Not cold, not punishing. Steady the way a wall is steady when it has been built correctly and has been carrying weight long enough to know how. "I need you to hear me. All of it. Don't speak until I'm finished." She pressed her lips together and nodded, chin trembling. "I don't regret a single day of raising you," I said. Not one morning. Not one night I sat up worrying. Not $1 I spent or didn't spend on myself so you could have what you needed. I would do all of it again, without hesitation. My throat tightened around the next words, but I pushed through them. "That is not what this is about." Emily made a small broken sound, and her eyes filled so fast the tears spilled before she could blink. "Dad, the moment you took your mother's photograph out of its frame," I said, "and put it in a trash bin to make room for a clothing rack that was not Daniel's decision. That was yours." I watched her face crumple. I kept going because stopping now would be the cruelest thing I could do. "The moment you stood in front of 300 people and announced that the home your mother and I built together was someone else's to keep you chose. And the moment you looked me in the eye and told me you wished I had died instead of her." My voice broke on that. Just once, just for a second, before it steadied. "You told me exactly where I stood." Emily was crying fully now, not the strategic tears, not the pressurized grief she had brought to my motel room. This was something that came from the floor of her ugly and real and too late. "I didn't mean it," she said, voice barely a sound. "I was in pain, and I didn't mean it. I believe you." I said it quietly, and I meant it. But Emily, a person can say something they don't mean, and it can still be true. The pain that makes you say a thing like that doesn't come from nowhere. I looked at my daughter through the rain. "You signed that paper yourself. Not me. Not Daniel. You made those choices before I made mine." She reached toward me with one shaking hand. "Please. You're all I have left." I stepped forward and put both arms around her. I held my daughter in the rain on the street where she had grown up outside the house that no longer belonged to either of us, and I felt her shake against my chest, and I held on until the shaking slowed. Then I stepped back, put both hands on her wet shoulders, and looked her in the face one last time. "I love you, Emily," I said. "I will always love you. But I cannot be the foundation you stand on while you decide whether I'm worth standing on. That's not love. That's just weight." I got back in the car. I started the engine. In the rearview mirror, Emily stood in the rain with her arms wrapped around herself, watching me go. I drove north toward the coast, the direction Margaret and I used to drive on Sunday afternoons, when the world felt too close. In my jacket pocket, Margaret's ring pressed warm against my chest. The radio stayed off. Oregon went on being beautiful outside the windows, and for the first time since the morning of my daughter's wedding, I breathed all the way down. I drove until the Pacific came into view, gray and vast and indifferent to everything that had happened in the past 3 weeks. I pulled over on a turnout above the water and sat with the engine off and Margaret's ring in my palm. People ask me what I learned from all of this. Here is my honest answer. I learned that love without boundaries is not generosity. It is an invitation. I gave everything I had to my daughter for 38 years and never once asked what she was building with it. That was not noble. That was negligent. Don't make the same mistake I did not, because your children don't deserve your love, but because love that has no shape cannot hold anything up. I know that now. I also learned this: the people who take the most from you will always find a way to make the taking feel like your idea. Watch for that. It is the oldest trick there is, and it works, because we want so badly to believe the people we love are who we need them to be. As for Emily, I pray for her. I mean that without bitterness. I believe in a God who can do more for a broken person than a tired old father can, and I have placed her there in those hands and tried to leave her there every morning since. These are the stories nobody puts in the family photo album. The family drama revenge that plays out in quiet rooms and wet driveways and parking lots outside grocery stores. The family drama revenge that doesn't look like the movies. The family drama revenge that leaves everyone smaller than they started. If any part of this story sat in your chest, the way it sat in mine, if you recognized something in it, leave a word in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, stay close to this channel, because the stories that matter most are the ones we almost don't tell. These are what we call family stories, revenge, and the truest ones never have clean endings. Thank you for staying with me until the last word. It means more than you know. The stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and perspective. If that's not the journey you're looking for today, no hard feelings. Choose what serves you. But if you're staying, I'll see you in the next one.